Hello and welcome to our book club episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. Before you enter panic mode that might sound like your inner voice saying, book club? I didn't know we had to read a book. What am I doing here? Retreat, retreat. Don't go anywhere. We will explain momentarily.
Exactly. So I'm your host, Amanda, and my amazing co-host and fellow bibliophile is...
Hello, I'm Meagan.
So yeah, we host this book club with new episodes every Thursday, but you don't even have to read the book if you don't want to. You can tune in and listen to our Sparks Notes, or if you're of a certain age, our age, you might just call them Cliff Notes, but in any event, you can listen along. We like to bounce around and cover a wide range of topics, everything from parenting to homeschooling, and even most recently, the shit show that is menopause, right? So we're glad you're here. We're glad you joined us, and we hope you'll stick around.
Now, we always say you don't have to read the book, and it's totally true. You do not. But can we go out on a collective limb? Can I speak for you here, Amanda?
I mean, you need this is the one, and I say it several times throughout my notes. This is the one you should buy.
Yeah, you are going to want to buy this book. This is the one, as Amanda said. Today we are starting our discussion of Soul School by Amber O'Neill Johnston. And it is a ridiculously epic reference source that is essential, an absolutely essential book to add to your library if you are diversifying your homeschool and decolonizing your reading list. If these are priorities in your homeschool life, like pause, go to the notes for the podcast, click the link, open it, hit add to cart, do it, and then come back and listen to us. You're going to want this book.
Yeah, for sure. So if you're new here, we are a secular progressive podcast, okay? Like secular progressive podcast. So this is right up our alley. We interviewed Amber a few weeks ago, actually, and that experience was totally awesome. If you haven't caught the episode yet, please go. It's only a few episodes back. You can find it in the queue. Check it out. Give it a listen. You will be absolutely captivated by her energy, her storytelling abilities. I mean, she made me cry during the episode. You might not be able to tell if you just listen. That was like a good thing. Yeah. Anyway, she had Meagan tearing up at one point. Like it was a really good talk. She's awesome. And I love her book, right? Like it's all come together really well. So today we're going to be discussing the foreword, the introduction, and chapters 1 and 2. I have a stupid amount of notes. Okay. I have a ridiculous amount of notes on this section. So we'll probably hear a lot from me and a lot less from Meagan. It is what it is.
Exactly. And I will say, right, we are, one of the things we talk about in many of our episodes is being neurodivergent affirming. I don't know whether it's neurodivergence or what, but we both only have, because we've been traveling since the book came out, we only have a digital copy of the book. And we typically read physical books, the two of us. I like to write in books. Amanda doesn't, but she's got a whole sticky note system. It's like
it's a very complex sticky note system, but it matters.
It's a very complex system. So we read the book, the digital copy, before we interviewed Amber to be able to tailor our questions and stuff like that. But when it came time to doing what we normally do for book club episodes, which was like, for me, I highlight and I write in the margins and then I go back and I create my notes. I can't do any of that because we've been traveling. Both of us have been world schooling and adventuring and traveling since before the book came out. So all we have is the digital press release copy that we were given. And let me tell you, it threw me for a loop. Like I could not function. If you have a kid who says, I can only read audiobooks or I truly dislike ebooks and I want a physical book, believe them, because let me tell you, it completely screwed up my mojo this week not having the physical book. I've ordered mine, but it's in the US and I'm not. So there we go, right? Yeah. So yes, definitely more Amanda this week because my brain couldn't comprehend an ebook. Apparently those things don't sync up, but we'll chat. It'll be good.
Yeah, that's it. We'll have a good chat. And also, that's just me, right? Like every week I come with a stupid amount of notes for book club because I write all of my thoughts down. I have great thoughts. I think I'm amazing. But the reality is I also have really bad brain fog. And so whether or not I have those thoughts at the appropriate time or when I need to recall them, it's anyone's guess. So I write everything that I want to say down in the notes so I don't forget it. And then Meagan has, like little things that jog her memory because she can do that and I can't. So again, one of those differences, right? So it looks like I have way more to say, but that's not usually the case. So anyway, let's dive in, right? So we're starting with the foreword. And I just want to say that if you read this foreword and you don't get excited to read the rest of the book, I'm not sure we can be friends. Like the foreword is just so well written. It's from I'm not even gonna try to say the person's name because I will butcher it in awful ways, but it's an author that Amber knew and she did this beautiful foreword. And I mean, I just if she doesn't get you excited to read this book, like I said, we can't be friends. But and plus also, okay, we should all know someone who will write about us the way that this person has written about Amber. I mean, we aren't all going to be friends or even acquaintances with respected authors, but still, this is what deep respect and friendship is all about. Like, it is such a beautifully written forward.
It's beautiful. Yeah, totally agree. And I will say, like, we're not gonna share pieces of it here because we'd have to read the whole thing to do it justice.
Mhm.
And it's an interesting balance for us with this book because, sometimes we say, like, the book is okay, but we'll just give you the highlights because do you need this book? Like, yeah, it's okay. We'll tell you the high points and you can move on with your life. Like, we don't wholeheartedly recommend every book we pick for book club because most of the time they're first read throughs for us. Some of them we hate, and we're open about that too, right? But this one, we're like, no, you need to go buy this and have this deep, meaningful experience with this book. So it's like a balancing act for us here, trying not to overquote the book and ruin the read for you, while still explaining wholeheartedly why you need this book. So
Yeah, and I'm gonna put this out here, right? If you're just catching us or you're pretty new to us, Megan and I do not agree about everything. And just because Megan brings something to the table and is like, "You're gonna love this," I can absolutely be like, "Thanks, no thanks." And sometimes I do it a bit more nicely than "Thanks, no thanks," but still the summary is "Thanks, no thanks." Like, I have no problem doing that. And Megan brought Amber to me, and she's been raving about her, and she was super excited about this book. I'm like, "Fine, whatever," and, like, put it on there. It'll be fine. I read all kinds of things. If you listen to anything, I'm all about gathering knowledge. So, like, fine, I'll read it. I freaking love this book. I cannot wait to be back in the United States. So I have the physical copy in my hand so I can read it and then I can put my sticky notes in it and I can give it to my kiddo to read. Like this is the book. This might be this is for sure the best book that we've done in book club so far, in my opinion.
ooh,
So this is the book. And there are others, right, for specific things and whatever, but every parent who is raising a child, every caregiver who is raising a child should have this book. And I think there should be others for other minority and marginalized groups. I think if every marginalized group had a book like this, we would be a much better people in general. So,
we'd have to get people to read the book though too.
yeah, but I mean, even if just there was the resource, right? At
Yeah.
least the people who are in our Facebook group and who are, like-minded progressive homeschoolers, we'd all be on the same page and not flailing quite so much.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right, so that wraps up the forward, right? And then it brings us into the introduction. Before we dive in, there are a couple of things I want to talk about. So first off, this is called Soul School. It is about Black America and African American culture and life and just learning all about that. And I want to address the elephant in the room. Megan and I are both white women. We are both participating in multiracial families, right? So we're not, like totally oblivious, but the reality is we are both white women. Okay. So and we're not going to pretend otherwise. Also, I want to acknowledge that there is some discussion of attending church in this book. I think it's pretty impossible to discuss Black and African American history without touching on church. Pastors, gospel music, right? All of those things are pretty foundational to African American or Black American history. That doesn't mean that we aren't secular. It means that cultural and religious understanding are often essential to a more well rounded understanding of all sorts of things. And if you are homeschooling and you are avoiding all things religious because you want to be secular, I do think you're missing an important piece. Whether we like it or not, religion has played huge roles in all things throughout all of history. And this is kind of one of those examples.
So it's interesting that you say that. This isn't in my notes, but when you just said that, it jogged my memory. I went last year to the Homeschooling Unleashed conference in Raleigh, and Father Nathan Monk was the keynote speaker. And then there was this other guy. You might know him. His name is David something. Do you remember his name?
Yeah. Oh, because you asked me, it completely fled. I was like, oh, yeah, the two guys. I know them both. And then now I don't remember David's
Well,
last name, but
I'll say my thing. Did you get it?
not yet.
Okay. I was like, I know you just said brain fog, and then I put you on the spot. I'm like, do you know this person's name?
I have his 3 books at home, right? So this is not, it's not like I'm just like, oh, like, no, I know him. And I went to David and Father Nathan Monk's talk afterwards, like the virtual talk, like, it's kind of ridiculous.
So at the end of he did like the closing keynote, right? And he had a thing where he talked about religion. He grew up in a deeply religious environment and is now not that thing. And okay. And so he showed statistics of countries where world religions are part of the education system. He showed like the Nordic, Scandinavian countries. He showed the UK. He showed the US. So he talked about the fact that in the US, it is almost non-existent as far as being taught in public education. And I'm not saying proselytizing, I'm saying what are these world religions, right? Learning all the religions from a secular worldview perspective. He talked about the UK, and their percentage of education on world religions was kind of middle of the road. And then the Nordic and Scandinavian cultures had it much, much higher. And it was really interesting because he juxtaposed that against a chart of how religious those countries are overall, as far as their, policy making and just their dominance of religion within their everyday culture. And there was a direct correlation between high amounts of education regarding religion equals a less religious society, because the more people knew about these religions, the less adherence to blind faith existed. And so, and it is true, right? When you look at a lot of religions, they're pretty easy to poke holes into some of well, you just have to believe it because that's what faith means, right? And so it's like, okay, but hold on a second. And so when you approach it from a fact, secular worldview perspective, it diminishes a lot of that mystique, and it meant that people were less blindly following some of these religions. So to your point, Amanda, about if you're not teaching about religion, I'm not saying you need to be starting your day every day with Bible study. That's not what we're about, either one of us. But there is a great value, statistically speaking, according to this, in teaching that. Did you find his last name?
Yes, McAfee.
Oh, McAfee, like the antivirus software. Now I remember. Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's so true. I promise we're going to get back on book club here really quick. But I grew up in rural Iowa, and I actually had in high school world religions class. And I am so thankful that I had that. And I really doubt that they even still offer that anymore with the way things are these days. But I mean, how important is it to make sure that you're taking that step back and that opportunity to look at all of the pieces? Yeah. And I know it's complicated, right? Church trauma and religious trauma is real. And I'm not downplaying that. I think a lot of us have dealt with that and hopefully come out the other side or are in a process of coming out the other side of it. But that doesn't mean that we can pretend like it's not there. All right.
Mhm.
So let's see. My first actual quote from the introduction section, she said, quote, "I longed for tangible representation of my life, family, and community, but there was no way to ask for something I didn't even know existed."
Mhm.
And I just thought, I think that this is so true and that really all kids need this, even if they don't realize that they even want it, let alone need it.
Mhm. Yeah, I could not agree more. And then we've got another quote that we both actually jotted down. And it was so funny because this happened multiple times. Like you said, we don't agree on everything. But I was like, on this book, we're lined up pretty darn well. So Amber says in the introduction, there was a separation between who I was and the world I was expected to thrive in. Specifically, I was aware of my culture on Sundays at church and during family gatherings, but I learned not to expect any glimpses during the week. People like me weren't integral enough to the fabric of American education to be studied and appreciated in its classrooms beyond passing mentions of slavery or civil rights. We weren't significant enough to be celebrated during the school day or included in field trips, assemblies, or class projects. I didn't actively wrestle with this in reality then because I didn't know that my days could be or should be different. Black stories weren't a big deal. It just was what it was.
Yeah. I mean, and I think this is one of those things that you know it, especially if you're listening to a progressive homeschool podcast. You're like, you know this, but reading it in black and white and seeing it like that well laid out, you're like, yeah, gosh, yeah, like how true is that? And I think it's probably, like I said before, it's probably true for all minority marginalized groups, and I think a lot of progressive homeschoolers homeschool in many ways specifically to help counteract this narrative.
Mhm.
But it takes a lot of work because so many things that are out there, from curriculum to books to book lists. She specifically points that out later on in the book. There are just so many things out there are written in a way that doesn't stop to take the time to look at anyone except white people and the white people experience. And that's not, I mean, God, with the way the US is going right now, maybe we're going to end up there, but that's not the world that we live in right now, right? Where the salad bowl or the melting pot or whichever metaphor you personally like the sound of, right? Or you want to go with it. It's this idea of like diversity is really important. And it might not necessarily be easy to make sure that we're including all of these stories, but oh gosh, it's so important.
Mhm.
So
Well, I think to your point, when you said we know this logically, but I think part of it is Amber's writing style, number one, brings it to life in a way that even if you logically know it, is a whole new ballgame. And then the emotion that she manages to infuse the book with, as far as I can never understand what it is to live Amber's experience. And even reading the book, I still can't fully understand it. But goodness, she gets us as close as you could possibly get, right? With the way that she writes and the way she explains the way she experiences the world. It's so accessible to somebody who
yeah,
hasn't lived that experience. It's amazing.
that's it. Accessible and kind. And
Yes.
I know it is not her job to do the work and to be kind, right? And I'm not trying to tone police. I know that's a big thing. Um, but I also know that right now I need a lot more kindness. I need supportive, kind people in my orbit because I'm fighting a lot of not kind people outside of my orbit. And it's just it's so yeah, it's so I'll just leave it at that. It's so
Exactly. Amber's going to make you cry again, and she's not even here.
let's move on. And, um, all right, so let's see. So we're still in the introduction and it's in Roman numerals as most books do. So Megan hated her Latin class, so I'm just gonna say Roman numeral 15. She has a quote. It says, I wished for an intimate survey of Black American culture and experience told through children's literature, a celebratory book of books that I could follow while guiding my children's learning. And essentially, she wanted it. She couldn't find it. So she wrote her own so that all of us could benefit from her work. And I just think that's amazing. Like, I spend a ton of time researching a diverse bookshelf for our own home. I'm sure as shit not taking the time to put it into a book. So I think it's wonderful that she did.
Well, and for us to be able to get that book list from somebody that based upon the first half of the book, because the book is two halves, right? So
Mhm.
the beginning is kind of this deep dive that we're doing right now on Black American culture and all of this. And then the second half is the book list. And when we say list, it's not title and author, title and author. When we get there, holy crap, you're going to be blown away. Let's list like one of them just in full, like on our socials or in our Facebook group or something, so people can get a feel for just how detailed each of these entries is, right?
Yeah.
But so from the first half of the book, I now know, like if I didn't know Amber before, right? I know I can trust Amber and that this is a reliable source for information. If I'm going out and I want to get resources, because again, it's not her job, but if it's my job to educate myself and learn more and expand my horizons, I want to know that the sources that I'm using to do so are reputable sources. I mean, there's so many things on the internet where you can look it up and you're looking at it. I know I've had that. I mean, we've shared before, like while we are a secular podcast and Amanda's family doesn't church at all, but our family is Jewish. And sometimes I'll be looking something up and I want to know the history on something or the perspective on something. And I can Google it and I can read 8 different things. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to go to one person who I trust and who I know who's educated in this field or who I consider to be an authority, because you can't always trust what you find online. It's not always rock solid information. And so with Amber, we know we have that because this resource is the be all and end all.
Yeah, it's really great. Okay, so let's see. The next one, we have
The same.
the same quote and thoughts. So on page number Roman numeral, page number 16, the quote that I pulled out is, race will stop being a factor in books when it stops being a factor in society. I agree that it shouldn't matter, but it does. We're righting a wrong by adding books to our children's world that should have always been there. And again, right? So true. Absolutely true. Soul School is a great book to help add more Black authors to your reading list. But like, don't stop there, you know? And she wouldn't, like Amber wouldn't argue that you stop there either, right? Like, include Asian authors from various countries, Jewish authors, Muslim authors, those with various disabilities, those from the LGBTQIA2S plus community, right? Like, there are just so many different communities. Go all in on representing all of these different communities in your bookshelf because they matter. And I didn't pull it for this episode because I already had so many notes, but there's the percentage of books that are written for kids and youth in the United States that feature white characters. It's like 90% or something ridiculous. And when you look at the number that aren't white characters, they're animals. Like, it's not an Asian main character. It's not a Black main character. Like, we need to do better and we need to support the authors that are putting that out there.
And she goes on in that same section to talk about the fact that people or children in marginalized communities are the ones who are left to make the leap and imagine themselves in those stories because it's not just automatically put there. And so white children don't ever really have to do that work, but all these other children do in order to see themselves in any of these stories. And it's not fair. It doesn't make sense. It's not the world that we live in. It's not the world we should live in. So it's up to us to change it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I loved the quote that said, if books are just books and Black kids are expected to relate to white books, then white kids can relate to Black books too. It makes no sense that the expectation would only run one way.
Yep.
And that applies again, you know, it applies to Black and white and Asian and, whatever, able-bodied and neurotypical and, let's just across the board, all of it. Yeah. You can read all of those books, even if they don't apply to you. Not only can you, but you should.
Yeah.
Because that's what your world looks like. And if your world doesn't look like that, if you go outside and look around and your world doesn't look like that, fix it. Make it look like that. This is getting wildly close to a soapbox. Let's move on. All right. So my next comment was just actually like basically the next page. This happens pretty much all the way through, which is why I have so many notes. So she's talking about the importance of an expansion of literature. And she has this quote that says, "When I started this work, I never imagined encountering people who think kids should not read books representing the breadth of humankind." And she wraps up the intro by saying, "In part one, we'll look at attributes and values held dear for generations and aspects of history that highlight the pride and pain of the Black American experience. We'll dive into the art of storytelling and how the lives of Black authors and illustrators can inspire children as much as the stories they tell. Part two offers a robust book list with hundreds of handpicked titles, all written by Black authors. It's a well seasoned feast of ideas delivered through prose, verse, and visual art." And
Mhm.
I don't know how you can listen to those things and not be excited about what you're about to get. So,
I know. It's just too good. I love it. Okay, we have so much to discuss today. As Amanda said, she's got a lot of notes, which I'm glad for since I struggled with an ebook. So before we continue, we wanted to just remind you that we host a Patreon. We want to dedicate as much time as possible to Amber's incredible book. So I'm going to be super brief with my reminder, but just to let you know, for a small monthly fee, you can sign up. We have access. You'll have access to a themed unit study every month that is secular, that is own voice focused, that is vetted by our secular eyeballs. We also host live meetings to offer homeschool support, answer your specific questions, and community, right? If you live in an area, I have homeschooled primarily in areas where finding a secular person, holy cow, is it hard, right? So come find your people online. Amanda and I found each other online. We only met for the first time the other day. So you can absolutely find your community online if you're struggling in person.
yeah,
So there'll be a link in the show notes with a kick-ass coupon that'll get you your first month for like $1. So come hang out with us.
absolutely. And even for me, I live in Southern California. It's it's still a little hard to find community, but I have a disability that makes it really hard for me to drive, right? And so during the pandemic, right? During the height of COVID, it was really easy to make community online because everyone was online and doing these Zoom things and meeting people. And it was during that time that Megan and I met. But so much of the world has gone back to in person. And I can't go out constantly with these people. I can't drive myself to this place for this meetup and I can't get here for that. And I can't go inside a coffee shop to enjoy a cup of coffee with someone. That's not my world. So I love the fact that we're bringing back this, an online place where you can join and really create that community that we're all looking for.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. So back to the book. Now we are in part one, chapter one. It's called Black is Beautiful. She starts off talking about how most people are on a spectrum somewhere between being fully immersed in a culture and then the other end being only knowing bits and pieces from like TV shows and stereotypes, right? And then she discusses how important it is to be open to learning, right? Because most of us are somewhere in the middle. And sometimes they're the only option, sometimes they're the best option. But books, right? They can really do a lot for you. And so then she goes in again into this idea of literary mirrors and windows. We talked about this when Amber was on our regular podcast. So again, if you haven't listened, definitely go give it a listen. She described it. She did a much better job. It was more eloquent than what I'm going to do. But basically, so we're all on the same page. A mirror is a book that reflects back the person's own culture or identity, and a window is a book that provides a realistic view of how others live. And very few books are going to be just a mirror or just a window. So, a fun example that I was using to explain this to someone the other day is Gregor the Overlander. It's a middle grades chapter book that's really popular. He's from a major city. Okay, great. That's a mirror for us. He's got a little sister. That's a window for us. We've got an only child. His dad disappeared from his life. Again, not our case. So that's a window for us. He ends up in a world deep within the earth. That's probably going to be a fun fiction for all of us, right? But this idea of like you can identify with certain things, you won't identify with others, but you can still learn about the stress of having to take care of a little sister or think about a little sister or the stress of worrying about your mom because your dad isn't there or all of these kinds of things or even I would guess a lot of kids have no idea what it's like to have to go downstairs to the laundry room to do your laundry because you don't live in a major city within an apartment building where you're doing that, right? There are all of these things that you can learn about that you just wouldn't even think to learn through books. It's amazing.
Mhm.
I love books.
It's wonderful. And Amber brought up the concept of a sliding door where we all have the opportunity to envision ourselves in that world. So maybe that's the part where we all venture to the Middle Earth, right? That's our sliding.
Wait, a sliding door into Middle Earth.
We might want to retreat there soon anyway if things keep going the way they are up on the surface of Earth. So it might become desirable. Yeah, I love it. But yeah, go check that episode out because Amber's description is not that you didn't do a good job, Amanda, but Amber's description is wonderful.
Mhm.
Okay, on page 5, she starts to talk about there's kind of an introduction into the concept of Black joy. And I will fully admit that this is not something that I grew up with and not something, because I didn't grow up with it, it was not something that I knew or thought to include in my homeschool world in the beginning. I was sharing the same Black history, very limited Black history that I got in my education with my kids. And we were expanding on it and going much wider and much deeper, but not necessarily with a focus of adding joy. And so Amber says in there, these pages celebrate the beauty of Black American culture through entertaining tales smothered in caramel, dipped in chocolate, and sprinkled with Black joy. Our kids will examine cultural elements intrinsic to the Black experience via words and pictures penned and drawn by Black hands. And I loved that. And I think it is very easy, not just with the Black American experience, but other cultures as well, to focus on the major events that have been newsworthy or history worthy. And a lot of times those aren't amazing, right? Sometimes it's not the things that are super positive or super happy that are remembered, that are kind of seared into the history books and into our subconscious. And so that focus on infusing these discussions with joy, I thought was incredible.
Yeah.
Now,
Great point.
yeah. And then I think you have a ton of notes coming up on the next couple of sections. And I kind of had one overarching note. Amanda's got a bunch of notes on things that are coming up in the book as far as music and food and visual arts and language and stuff like that. And Amanda's got great notes that she's going to share. But I read that and saw a map, right? This is a roadmap. To Amanda's point before, if you are thinking, okay, this is great, but my family has Asian roots, or my family is a 2-mom family and we would like to explore the history. This is a roadmap for how you can do that. Amber goes into all of the different components that she's looking at when she's creating a well-rounded approach to education and to understanding culture and community. So, if you're planning a trip to Thailand, here's your roadmap. If your kiddo is super interested in anime or K-pop and you want to pivot off those and make it a little educational in a different way, here's your roadmap, right? Here's how you can kind of branch out and build those things. So, song and music was up first.
Yeah, so I pulled a lot of quotes. Again, that's probably because, like Megan said, we're doing a digital copy, and so it was easier to pull quotes directly and be like, "Oh yeah, that works. That's good." And her writing is so good and so eloquent that you just want to use a lot of her own words. It's kind of silly to paraphrase it in my words because then it's not going to sound nearly as nice. So she says, quote, "Our ancestors brought their music to America, and it survived because it was housed inside their bodies and could not be stolen." And I just thought this whole section on song and music was fascinating and incredibly moving. And I think you should read it. I think you should just go ahead and get the book and read it yourself and then hand the book to your kid and have them read it too. The just after that, like, she goes on and talks about, to give you kind of an idea of what's talked about in there, she talks about how it started with spirituals, which enslaved people used as creative resistance, self-expression, worship, and recreation. And then that evolved into Black gospel, which grew out of the northern churches in the 1920s and 1930s. And then from there grew freedom songs, blues, jazz, rock and roll, soul, funk, rap, and hip hop. And she just talks about all of that. And kind of like Megan said, you have all of these different things. I'm going to briefly touch on them so you have an idea of what we're talking about, but really, you should read it yourself and then if you're using it as a roadmap, like Meagan said, the real point is you're not going to find a book that covers all of these things. But if you can find books that touch on different aspects, you're getting a more well-rounded idea and understanding of the culture that you're talking about, right? Because these are the important things, or kind of the key things. So then the next main section she had was on cuisine. I'm going to just put this out there. I know very little about soul food or Southern cuisine in general. I generally enjoy grits. I like chicken and waffles, especially the sweet potato waffles, right? I've been to a few of those kind of Southern restaurants or soul food restaurants. But most of this section is kind of hard for me to truly comprehend. And to that end, I'll be looking specifically for a good window book recommendation in part 2.
Kind of helpful because it identifies holes that you didn't know you maybe had or weren't focused on, right? And then you're like, oh yeah, I really don't. I've never eaten any of these things. I've never heard of some of these things, right? So
Yeah.
we got to figure this out. I like it.
Yeah. All right, so the next section is visual and performing arts. She says, quote, "There's no stylistic art that children need to imagine as singularly representing our culture. Instead, exposure to the movement and images conceived by Black faces, hands, and bodies will give them a steadfast appreciation for the creativity pulsing through our art." And I just thought that was a great point, right? It's easy to try to pinpoint one specific thing and not remembering, like she says it later on too, it's not a monolith. It's important to remember that it's about all of the different things that come together to make a whole, right?
Mhm.
She also talks about the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s. Lots of great resources out there. She's going to have some in the book later on as well, but there are lots of good things, and that's worth diving into in your own homeschool. She talks about how many performing arts, much like oral song, traveled across the Atlantic. And I thought that was interesting. Again, one of those things, if I really sat and thought about it, I know it, but it's in black and white. And you're like, oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. If you're watching the podcast Light Change, it's getting dark here in Cyprus. Okay. So page 11 starts a new section called Communication and Language. And the thing that I kind of pulled out of this, I did not know all of these, right? So she says, quote, "The language of Black America has been given various names over time." I did know that. I'm not that out of it. Including Ebonics, African American Vernacular English. That one was a little bit of a mouthful. African American English, Black English, and African American language. Okay, so the author calls it Black English, just so if that's what we're referring to throughout the discussion, that's because that's her word choice. And she points out that there are regional varieties and that it isn't static, right? It's important to remember. I'm going to say this is another one of those things. I feel like I can't easily cover it well. So, again, I'm going to really, really encourage you to pick up the book and read the section on your own.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I will say, she made a point to say that if you are reading books, especially like picture books or things like that, and you're having a hard time with the pronunciation of the Black English or African American language that's used in it, she recommends leaning on audiobooks and read aloud videos. So like a lot of times if you go to YouTube and type in a specific title and author, read aloud, you can find someone reading it aloud for you. And I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. We do that sometimes. You might not believe it, but I do it for every author name I have to pronounce. The problem is by the time I get to podcast and try to pronounce, I don't remember what
It's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. We did talk about that whole brain fog earlier, but I use it all the time. I try.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Okay. And so then the next section is on page 12. She talks about science and sports. She's talking about the importance of celebrating the achievements of Black athletes in the same way that we celebrate artistic, scientific, musical, academic, literary, and other types of achievement. The quote that I really pulled out that spoke to me was, quote, "Stories of Black athletic success can build a foundation for our children's understanding of the behind the scenes finances and power dynamics of sports." And I was like, oh, that's a good, creative critical thinking topic to dive into, right? Like, that's a good one.
So true. Rabbit hole discovered.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Then she goes into Black Church, and Amanda's got some notes on that. I will just say, if you have not read Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, his description. So Trevor Noah's mother is deeply religious, knows the Bible inside and out. He's talked about the fact that he emails with his mother every day. She doesn't text. And that he emails with his mother every day. And to this day has these deep philosophical debates on theology and the Bible and all this kind of stuff. That's the environment that he was raised in. And he talks about the fact that he would go to 3 church services every Sunday with his mother. They would go to white church, they would go to black church, and then they would go to a mixed church. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, that makes sense. And his descriptions of each and how they vary and the way the Bible is interpreted and the way the communication is and the way the music is and the way people interact with one another. One of the most brilliant things I've ever read. So if you have not read that yet, incorporate it into this digging deeper on Black Church because it's fascinating.
Nice. Okay, so the author that we're reading right now, Amber, she points out that the church building itself housed meetings and operations for social change before, during, and after the civil rights movement. And so I mentioned it before. I just want to reiterate, like, I know church trauma happens in every culture, and I'm not saying to disregard that, right? Like, we're not saying that it didn't happen or that it doesn't matter or that you have to ignore it and go all in on that. That's not what we're trying to say here. But I do encourage people to keep an open mind around learning about how the Black church played such a significant role in both the past and the present of Black Americans. I mean, I don't think you can be listening to this podcast and not know of and have a healthy respect for Martin Luther King Jr. And he was a minister. I mean, like, this is the reality.
I had that conversation with somebody. I was adminning a Facebook group that I don't admin anymore, but somebody had posted something. It's a secular group, and somebody had posted a quote that had nothing to do with religion, but the person was a religious figure, right? And the quote was not offensive or anything like that, right? And it got reported to me as the admin, like, this is, this person is religious, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, and it was January. It was the end of January. I will never forget because I was like, we literally just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. So, like, if we are going to throw out everything that a person who is tied to religion has said, we literally have to throw out Dr. King. Like, I get it. It's a difficult line to balance if you have this background and this experience, right? But yeah, I mean, we've walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama. We walked the route where the boycotts would start every day in Selma. It starts at a church. I mean, it started and ended at a church. That's where the people who were injured were taken and all of that. I mean, it's interwoven in that whole part of the history, and it's hard to separate. And it makes it difficult for people who have a difficult relationship with religion.
Yeah. And I want to say again, like, we get it. I especially get it, right? I was absolutely raised in the church. I was raised in a very conservative church. I suffered in a very conservative church. I was, it took a lot to walk away from it. It took a lot of learning and educating it to be truly okay with where I am. And we make a very, very conscious decision to not church in any way, shape, or form. So I do get it. But still, you have to learn through a certain lens when it comes to Black American history. Okay, so I do want to also say we've been talking about this. The author does make a point of saying that the books included aren't meant to proselytize. I said that wrong, but you know what I mean. They are meant to teach, not preach. And again, I appreciated that. Like, I come from a place where I definitely want that. We don't have any children's Bibles or anything like that in our home. Like, we don't want books that preach. We just want to. All right. So that brings us to the next section. It's I think the last one in chapter 1. It's called Hair, Skin, and Beauty Sense. Again, pick up the book, read the section. As a white woman, I don't feel like I can or really have any business teaching on this, about this, right? But there's really good information in here. There's 100% food for thought information. And just like, it's worth your time. Read it, noodle it, grow, right? Been having a lot of conversations in our Facebook group here lately of like, hey, it's okay. You didn't know. And there's, you don't know what you don't know. As long as you're here to learn, that's what we care about.
Hey, okay,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. All right, then. So that wraps up chapter 1. That brings us into chapter 2. The title of chapter 2 is called Intangible Assets.
And I will just start out by saying this is where I fully gave up trying to take notes. I cannot read an ebook and be expected to digest the information and take notes. I can't do it. And I was like, screw it. I'm going to just chat with Amanda about her notes. So I gave up here.
I wonder if you should find like a place to print and go like just print off like paper, like pages.
That
so you
would
can
help me
write on it for the next
tremendously.
one. Yeah. I mean, I would not recommend that for the vast majority of people, right? Like buy the printed book, but we're both in kind of a unique situation where it's like, oh, you could buy it and you'll get it in Europe in 3 months and like that club will be over.
I went in. So the other day, Amanda and I met up at the airport, which we talked about in our regular episode. And on the way back, I stopped at this mall that is huge. I mean, I should Google how big it is compared to the Mall of the Americas, which we always hear about being so big. It was insane how big this mall is. And there was a bookstore there, and there were 2 books that I was looking for. I asked if I could get a physical copy of this book. And then I also asked about another book that was about how to suss out fake news that's been kind of making the rounds in some of the groups that I'm in, and they didn't have either one. So I was like, okay, back to my ebook I go.
I mean,
But I tried.
that's it. And that's the hard thing, right? Like I know because I was looking that I can get most things shipped to Italy if I'm willing to wait about a month and pay quite a bit extra in shipping and handling. And then I'm just like, but I'll be back home and I won't necessarily have to use Amazon. And, like I know there's a day that's supposed to be don't use Amazon and any of the other big ones, but there was also this idea that like we would cut back for the entire month and see. And so I'm trying, like to get in on that. So
It's working too. Did you see the lawsuit that Target got slapped with from their shareholders? It's working.
no, I haven't seen that.
Yeah. After they cut their DEI program and people boycotted, their stock tanked and they had a huge dip in sales. And their shareholders sued them for misleading them about the impact that cutting the DEI program would have. And I was like, it's right. Who cares, right? And so it's working. Stop spending money at the places that aren't doing what we want them to do. It's working. Hit them where it hurts.
Yeah, which is great because we cut in a lot of places when Trump got elected and we still aren't back. And didn't make a big difference there. So I'm glad to hear that there are places where it's making a difference this time around. Okay, so back to chapter 2, tangible assets. The quote that I pulled out for this chapter is, she says, quote, like all groups, Black Americans are not a monolith. We are a rich tapestry of varying, sometimes even contradicting, viewpoints, behaviors, and identities. There is no single way to, quote unquote, be Black. At the same time, deeply rooted and commonly held beliefs and values help define our culture, even if they are not held or followed by everyone equally or even at all. And that's what this chapter attempts to cover in general, right? So it's again broken down into a lot of different smaller sections that give these easy to read and digest bites, right? It's just good. And truly, I mean, I would have no qualms whatsoever handing this to my 11-year-old. I think, and reading, depending on reading ability and critical thinking skills based on what you're talking about in your own home, you could easily go down to probably age 8 for reading this and having a jumping off point for discussion and things like that. I really think that this book in and of itself, part 1, as just a good place to learn and talk and all kids of all ages. But as much as you could start with like an 8-year-old, I think you could absolutely have your 17-year-old read it and make a great conversation out of it as well, right?
Oh, heck yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will freely admit, if you're watching the video, I am nodding along a little bit while you're talking, because when my boys are out of town this weekend, they're in Birmingham playing in a tournament, and my 13-year-old just messaged me. I don't want to interrupt you because you were like mid-sentence, but it's interesting. In the world of teenager parenthood, you're not quite there yet, Amanda, but like when they message you, it's like more than like an emoji or like what, like full sentences. It's like, oh, I'm going to engage right now. Well, he's actually engaging. So sorry, I nodded along. I freely admit I was a little tuned out in that last section, but having a good day.
Yeah, this is real life.
My boys, they're playing in a tournament, and they normally play Pokemon a lot, which I've talked about, but they're playing in Yu-Gi-Oh this weekend. My younger kiddo is like a huge Yu-Gi-Oh player, and my older one, not so much. So the younger one like prepped him for the tournament and all that stuff. And I had said to him yesterday, I kind of pulled him aside and I said, listen, like, remember, he's new. Be very supportive, be very uplifting. I mean, they get along great. They're best friends, but still, like, social emotional intelligence, like, you might not necessarily know to be in that moment when you're also in the moment and you're playing and you're excited because you're doing really well, and he's struggling because he's new and, you know, whatever. So he texted me and he was like, here are my results. Here's Aiden's results. And I was like, okay. I said, just remember what we talked about being uplifting and all of that kind of stuff. So I just had to have a little parenting aside there, but continue with your thoughts about the book. Sorry.
Plumbing. It never stops.
Never. Right?
Nope. Okay. So on page 18, we have the first section. It's called intergenerational bonding. I had some complicated thoughts on a lot of the sections in this chapter. I think whether you agree with this or not, whether you think that you would want to implement these ideas or not in your own home, it is worth reading it and understanding where a lot of these things are coming from, and that kind of foundational understanding for a lot of the books you're going to read later on. So this is one of those, right? And there's this idea of respect for elders. She gives some specific examples. And then she also goes on to say that it's definitely not one-sided, and that Black people absolutely adore their children and their grandchildren. And she gives kind of an example of like, you know, go try to be ugly to a child with their grandparents or, you know, a Black granny around, and you're going to find out real quick that that's not okay, which I thought was interesting. A nice dynamic shift for some of the respect your elders cultures that we see. She also talks about mother wit. And she's talking, so basically that's sayings that share collective wisdom of the generations. Also, she had some in the book. I wanted to read them out because I'm like, oh, you know, like some of them are, and some of them like, oh yeah, that's so. Always cook extra so you never have to turn away a friend or foe. Wear an apron when you're working so folks know not to pester you when you take it off. Don't let anyone borrow more than you're willing to lose with a smile. Marry a man who lets you overhear him telling others how much he loves you.
I love that one.
I really liked the one about never letting anyone borrow more than you'd be willing to lose with a smile. I say that all the time, right? Like, how much did I loan someone? Like, only as much as you don't mind not getting back, right?
Yeah.
And then the last one that I really liked was don't ever mistake service for weakness. And I was like, oh, yeah, I feel like that's especially valid these days. So the next one after intergenerational bonding starts on page 20. It's called extended kinship. And she says, cousins are seen as close relatives, even if they're third cousins or cousins twice removed. The elusive distant relative designation is reserved for people we don't know rather than how far away a person may sit on the family tree. And I thought that was interesting. That's quite different from some of what I know. And she also goes into the idea of family, which is people who are considered family, even if they aren't technically family. There's lots of other ways of saying that, like family is what you make and blood doesn't make a family and
chosen family. Yeah.
Chosen family. There's lots of different words for it, but I'd never heard family before. That was fun.
It is a fun saying.
Yeah. Okay, so then the next section is the Africa diaspora connections. And she just talks about, the quote says, Black people worldwide carry aspects of common culture based on their shared experiences of enslavement, persecution, colonialism, exploitation, oppression, and abuse. This is an undeniable reality that can't be reworked or sugarcoated. Despite these connections rooted in hardships, these groups share artistic expressions, cuisine, storytelling, and values. And that's something I hadn't really thought about. So I appreciated that point. Then the next section is our relationship to the land. And she's got some good quotes. She starts right off saying it's complicated and beautiful. Then she goes on more specifically. Historically, we were forced to work lands for little or no pay through slavery, sharecropping, and tenant farming. Public lands of the great outdoors haven't always been available to us in the same ways or at all. And she talks about how there's an ongoing problem with messaging, like national parks and other outdoor initiatives, and also a general lack of awareness and recognition around Black environmentalists, herbalists, scientists, growers, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, that was just one of those, like, I will fully admit I haven't thought much about it. Admittedly, I don't think much about the land, if at all possible. I'm a city girl. I moved away from the farmlands and I'm very happily narrowly focused on city living. But it was a good, like, think bigger picture about other people and what that looks like.
If you haven't listened to our episode about planning a national parks road trip, you should tune in to get Amanda's full feelings about exploring nature.
So yeah, and I will say during the episode with Amber, she specifically touched on this some in a way that really brought it to light for me. So when I came back through and did a deeper read for book club, this really stood out to me because I had that conversation with Amber.
Mm-hmm.
She says, quote, soul school books show children that history impacts our relationships with each other and the environment. They'll understand that Black people engage with and belong in the natural world despite the complexities of the human nature bond.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's good. I'm looking forward to really diving into which books kind of touch on that and focus on that aspect later on. So then the next one is Southern Roots and Influences. I know you have lived in the South, though probably not like deep South areas because you were definitely more cities. I lived in the mountains of North Carolina for a couple of years. Again, I also wouldn't call that deep South, Appalachia, but not deep South. And even it was really hard for me to understand. Then there was no embracing it. I'm from the North. That it is what it is. Her quote says, however, careful consideration is given not to overrepresent this area because Southern culture is not synonymous with Black culture. The urban centers and suburban outposts in other parts of the United States have contributed to and continue to pour into the ever-changing vibrancy of African American life. They too deserve recognition and exploration.
That's such an excellent point. Because in my mind, I'm a unit study lover and builder, and in my mind, my brain goes to the places where so much of the notable history that has been shared with us, or at least in my education, and that is in the South, right? That's such a brilliant point.
Yeah. And see, for me, it was a little reassuring because I grew up in rural Midwest and I went to university in Chicago. And it was the first time that I really saw a lot of Black culture and history and all of that. And so that's what I often think of. And so then I'm thinking like, I'm starting thinking like, oh man, I've got it all wrong. It's like, it's the South. And that reminder of like, no, it's not the South, right? It's all of these things. It's
Everywhere, yeah.
and it's the cities and it's the South and it's the suburban stories and all of this. Like, it's a good reminder. The next one was cultural communication, mannerisms, and idioms. This is another one. I'm white, okay? I can read you the whole section, but that's going to make book club really, really long. I have no business trying to like distill it down into something that a white person understands. So please just read this section. It's good. It's great information. She does it well. She shares it well. Go read it. And then she wraps up with this chapter. And for our book club, this section for us with the power of Black joy. And she says, Black people have endured suffering while smiling, singing, dancing, and gathering. This behavior is not a denial of hardship or our lived experiences. Instead, it's a reclamation of control over our spirits and emotional health. It's an actively resistant, you can do this and that, but what you won't do is rob me of my joy type of thing. And just that idea that Black people can experience goodness despite everything. That's what Black joy is. And yeah, Meagan touched on it earlier, but it's a good reminder, right? And we're all guilty of it, of, focusing on the big moments in history, not the everyday,
Uh-huh.
in and day out living and joy that can and should be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an incomplete history lesson. It's an incomplete experience. It's an incomplete place to operate from as a human being. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that was a lot to unpack, and we're only to the end of chapter 2, people. So listen, if you order your book right now, there's a potential that you will have it before your next episode, depending on when you're listening to this. So grab your copy. It'll make following along that much more meaningful. This book is too good to gloss over the details. So 2 quick things as we wrap up. Number 1, we would love for you to review our podcast or give us a like or whatever the thing is on the platform that you're on. Please do that thing. It goes a long way in helping us put out kind of like a big shiny bat signal to find other secular progressive homeschoolers. Community is so important, and especially with the United States in turmoil right now, support makes even this horrendous shit show better. So let's be friends. The second thing is the link to Amber's book is below. We've mentioned it before. Grab your copy. Thank you for tuning in, for joining us. Tune in next week. We'll be talking about chapters 3 and 4. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Yeah. Have a great one.